Welcome everyone to the 2021 McGivney lectures given by Dr. David Schindler. I'm Father Antonio Lopez, the Provost Dean of the John Paul II Institute. Finally, COVID postponed this event. And finally, we're able to have it here live at the Catholic University of America. Shaky podium. So I'll give an introduction today, and I think it'll be good for the next 2 days as well. So first I'd like to say a little bit of why we do these lectures. Venerable Father Michael McGivney, who, as most of you probably know, will be beatified on October 31st, founded the Knights of Columbus in 1882 as a fraternal benefit society to protect the widows and children of working men and to foster their faith and their social progress. In honor of Father McGivney, the Institute periodically invites distinguished Catholic scholars to lecture in the fields of theology, philosophy, and allied disciplines. Since the institution of the lecture series, presenters have included personalities such as John Finnis, Elizabeth Anscombe, Ralph McInerney, Kenneth Schmitz, Benedict Ashley, Jérôme Lejeune, Cardinal Schomburg, Cardinal Wallet, and the most recent ones that some of you may remember, Father Ivan Rupnik in 2005, who spoke on the spiritual meaning of spousal love, Professor Robert Spemann in 2010, who spoke of the nature and natural law in the present cultural situation on issues concerning the dignity of human life, and Professor Stanislaw Grigel, who spoke on discovering the human person with Blessed John Paul II. The last one given by Professor Giorgio Buccellati in 2015 was titled The Four Republics on the Origin and Development of Human Community. Most of these McGivney lectures are published in the imprint of the Institute Humanum Press. We see these lectures, therefore, as a sustained reflection on important theme to our culture, to our ecclesial situation, and to our work at the Institute. And we look forward to hearing them. Eventually we'll have them available as a book. Now a word on our speaker tonight. Dr. Schindler has served as the Edouard Cardinal Gagnon Professor of Fundamental Theology at the Institute since 1992, and led the Institute as Dean from 2000 to 2010. Formerly a Weaver Fellow and a Fulbright Scholar, Dr. Schindler previously taught for 13 years in the program of liberal studies at the University of Notre Dame, and for 3 years at Mount St. Mary's University, before Notre Dame, obviously. Since 1972, he has been assistant editor and then editor-in-chief of the North American edition of Communio, International Catholic Review, a federation of journals founded by Hans Urs von Balthasar, Joseph Ratzinger, Henri de Lubac, and other European theologians. He also still serves as editor of the series Ressourcement, Retrieval and Renewal in Catholic Thought. Professor Schindler has published over 75 not-so-short articles, translated in 9 languages, in the areas of metaphysics, philosophical issues in biology, biotechnology, relation, theology and philosophy, culture, so on and so forth. He's published also several books. The most recent ones are The Generosity of Creation in 2018. 2015 was Freedom, Truth, and Human Dignity, the Second Vatican Council's Declaration of Religious Freedom, a new translation, Reduction, History, and Interpretation of Dignitatis Humanae, co-author with Professor Nicholas Healy. In 2011, Order in Love, Liberal Societies and the Memory of God, and the Heart of World, Center of the Church, Communion Ecclesiology, Liberalism and Liberation. Also, a number of edited collections, as well as many other major accomplishments. Dr. Schindler will present the, the lectures these 3 days. They are titled Modernity and the Gift of the Given. John Paul II's Authentic Theology of Integral Human Liberation. Today he'll speak on the Primacy of God. On Wednesday, September 30th, on Truth and Freedom. And then on Thursday, the last one, on Integral Liberation. Let me give you just a couple of logical details. So Dr. Schindler will speak tonight for around 50 minutes. Yes? 50 minutes. To be followed by questions and answers. For those of you with us here in the room, we'll tell questions. There is a microphone there, so just please, when just raise your hand, and I will call you. Just come to the mic to ask your question. For those of you who are following this on the internet through our YouTube channel, just please email your questions to Meredith Rice. So that is mrice@johnpaulii.edu. And also subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's pretty good. You're able to see all these videos and many more that will be coming up. Yes, and then please remember after the lecture, if you gotta be mindful of social distance, masks, and all these policies that we have wholeheartedly embraced recently. So now please join me in welcoming Dr. Schindler.
Thank you, Father Antonio. Can you hear me? Is this on? It's on? Okay. Excuse my voice. The focus of the 3 lectures, the first tonight is on John Paul II's Authentic Theology of Integral Human Liberation, and focusing that in terms of modernity and the gift of the given. And then the second lecture will continue that theme, but in a different context, in a more technical context, which has to do with the relation of truth and freedom, moral truth and obligation, religious truth and fraternal love, as a way of continuing to discuss the same problem that I will open up tonight. And then the final lecture will come back to fairly explicitly to many of the themes in the first lecture, but in an American context, and then it will elaborate more fully the issue of liberalism, liberal societies in the American context. So that's the basic structure, and the overall title, I guess, is the modernity and the gift of the given of the 3. So in the first, I'll talk about the primacy of God, and primarily what that means for Wojtyła, and then to a limited extent what that means in liberal societies. But this first lecture and the last lecture fit closely together in the sense that that I take America to be for a number of reasons, to be a paradigmatic liberal society, and that's mainly because I'll have more to say about this when I get into lecture 3. That's mainly because, as many or most of you know, American liberalism doesn't begin from within a society which was foreign, religiously speaking, or it wasn't, in France, for example, overthrowing the Ancien Regime which was a Catholic and still in some sense. But what's unique in America is that the conceptions are sort of native to America. And that's a very different thing. They're worked out, and there's a direct influence of Protestantism, specifically Puritan Protestantism. Okay, but those two lectures will fit together. I mean, they both have their integrity. But okay, the primacy of God. In Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, on loving God, we read the striking words, "In the first creation, God gave me myself, but in his new creation, he gave me himself. And by that gift, restored to me the self that I had lost. Created first and then restored, I owe himself twice over in return for the gift of myself. But what have I to offer him for the gift of himself? My basic reality as a creature and as a Christian consists in my being a gift from God, calling for gratitude in this double sense. Recognizing that gift constitutes the very core of being, we understand that each one's action at the most primitive level cannot but consist in grateful response at some level, grateful response to what is always God's prior initiative as creator and finally also as redeemer. It is safe to say that the great saints of the Christian tradition all had some significant sense of this memory of God's initiative inside the origins of their being and acting. St. Thomas, with his fundamental distinction between being or esse, the to be of things, and essence or essentia, the fundamental what that structures each being, articulates for us the meaning of the creature as gift in its most profound ontological sense. In the act of creation, God gives each of us to ourselves, even as in this very act we ourselves become active participants, active subjects of God's creative generosity. All of us bear a sense of our givenness as good, of our being given as being loved, and thus as gifts. The important philosopher and critic of Anglo-American culture, George Grant, knowing that he was terminally ill, and this is in the mid-1980s, wrote the following in his notebook, and I quote, "To put the matter in language not easy for moderns, Christianity is at its center concerned with grace, if that word is given its literal meaning. Grace means simply that the great things of our existing are given us, not made by us, and finally not to be understood as arbitrary accidents. Our making takes place within an ultimate givenness. However difficult it is for all of us to affirm that life is a gift, it is an assertion primal to Christianity. Through the vicissitudes of life, the tragedies, the outrages, the passions, the disciplines, and the madnesses of everyday existence, to be a Christian is the attempt to learn the substance of that assertion." End of quotation. Finally, the focus of our lectures, St. John Paul II, in his essay Meditation on Givenness, signed in February 1994, 6 days after he signed Letter to Families, affirms that there are times when all men, even non-believers, glimpse the truth of the givenness of creation and begin to pray, to acknowledge that all is a gift from God. And again, in the same essay, he says that man is drawn up into the mystery of God by the fact that his freedom is subjected to the law of love. End of quote. To be sure, it is only over time and with maturity and growth in Christian faith that we come to understand the depth and breadth of this gifted character of our original givenness. My initial point is simply that what is affirmed by Christian saints like Bernard, and important Christian thinkers like Grant, and the subject of our lectures, John Paul II, resonates down through the being of all of us, of every human being. By virtue of our givenness as creatures, we cannot but affirm ourselves in affirming our own identity as gifts from another, finally from God. I'll have more to say about the Thomistic structure for that, in dealing with John Paul II. In a word, I cannot consciously know or love without knowing and loving God, at least implicitly, in my depths in each of these acts. No human act can ever be simply abstracted from God, from the reality of God. It will be our task in these lectures to address fundamental aspects and implications of these assertions in light of the writings of St. John Paul II. The burden of my announced theme is simple but fundamental. Love, or acts of God-centered giving and receiving, operate implicitly at the root of all of our actions, giving form to all of them. To act, or to exercise intelligence or freedom, is at root implicitly to love ourselves and all that is, and in our deepest depths, to love God above all. The claim is radical, but true. This original love, which searches implicitly from its roots for the God incarnate in Jesus Christ, implies an abiding ontological, theological unity in the cosmos, within the cosmos, that cannot but shape in some significant way all human being and acting, and indeed, in a principled but analogous sense, all that exists in the cosmos. In the traditional language of causality, then, such unity has to do not only with the final end of our human journey, but also with its origin and form. The words of T.S. Eliot, which probably all of you have heard, beautiful words, in his 4 quartets, help us see the paradoxical unity of end and beginning, and indeed form, that is implied in the argument we intend to develop. Eliot says, and I quote, "Home is where one starts from. What we call the beginning is often the end, and to make an end is to make a beginning, the end is where we start from. He continues, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." The ontological theological ground for the paradox indicated in poetic terms by Eliot seems to me implied in the thought of St. Augustine and St. Thomas. Just to pick two examples here. St. Augustine says, and I quote, "God is higher than my highest self, and at the same time more interior to me than I am to myself. Supremo et interior meo." St. Thomas, for his part, points toward something similar in his own way when he says that we know God implicitly in all that we know and love God implicitly in all that we love. So there's some real knowledge, but obviously there's a note of there's something there that one does not know fully. But when eventually as one comes to know that, it's recognized as something I was seeking. These words of Eliot, and in light of those of Augustine and Thomas, recall our opening comments regarding being as gift, are being created by God in Jesus Christ and recreated or restored by God in Jesus Christ, and bring us to the burden of these lectures, namely that buried within each of us, within the depths of each of us as given, is a sense of our reality as gift, and hence of ourselves as participants in a goodness and truth and beauty of which we are not the original generators. The words of Eliot help us make sense of the deep paradox implied here. That is, we start most fundamentally with a sense of being loved, and we sense implicitly that is the direction in which we are obliged to move. We cannot but know from the beginning at some basic level that we are loved and are thereby moved to love in response. Our end is to know and love God in all things and above all things. We sense from our earliest years that we are created for this. Our fundamental purpose in life involves responding to God's gift of myself and of Himself in His act of creating and redeeming me. This response includes bringing everything that is, all of creation, along with us, so far as in our power to do that. Assisting everything to deepen and extend its own intended participation in God's creative and redemptive gift-giving. So I want to move now, that's an introduction to the theme and the fundamental structure of the argument. And now I would like to cite a number of texts from John Paul II, which are somewhat arbitrary, but they're because his texts are so abundant. But they're so rich relative to this point. Now, they help us deepen and expand it. So, they help and frame the argument that I'm making throughout these lectures. For John Paul II, this love that I've been referring to originates in the Creator God of Christianity. All creatures are born within and by virtue of God's love and moved thereby to love God in response. In the first words of his first encyclical, Redemptor Hominis, 1979, John Paul II states that Jesus Christ is the center of the universe and of history. In Dives in Misericordia, an encyclical written a year later in 1980, the Pope, citing the well-known text from Gaudium et Spes 22, states that Christ, the new Adam, fully reveals man to himself and brings to light his most high calling, and does this in the very revelation of the mystery of the Father and his love. The words quoted here, says the Pope, are clear testimony to the fact that man cannot be manifested in the full dignity of his nature without reference not only on the level of concepts, but also in an integrally existential way to God. Man and man's lofty calling are revealed in Christ through the revelation of the mystery of the Father and of his love. These first words of John Paul II's first encyclical are, of course, not meant merely as rhetorical expressions. On the contrary, they convey the substance of what his papacy is to be about, and what he takes created beings to be about. Center here refers to what lies at the heart of things, and thus to that around which things turn or toward which they gravitate. As a verb, it can mean to rest or to rest in as a center, or again to refer to a pivotal point of attention and activity. The Pope means this in terms that are fully ontological, that refer to the fundamental order of reality. That is sort of an obvious statement, but in the world in which we live, it's important to pay attention here to the emphasis, the ontological center, the fundamental order of reality. It's not merely a matter of moral intentionality, a kind of moralism. We're going to come back to that point over and over and over again in these lectures. I mean, later in this one, and then especially in 3, but also in the second one. The point is here, and I think I mean, he doesn't have America, I'm sure, explicitly in mind, but he has liberal societies in mind, certainly with the help of Cardinal Ratzinger. And what is the point? It seems to me, in liberal societies, especially in the paradigmatic liberal society of America, this is often understood in a way that we moralize belief in God. That is, we believe in God, but we take the logic of our lives from the culture. So, for example, what's the order? What's an economic order? What's an academic order? What's a political order? What's a way of life? How do we, as we go through the course of life, the day, what's its order? Not the problem here, and then I'll go on and we'll come back to it later, is that if we don't see that it's a matter of order, much of what the Pope has to say is not all that important. It's sort of, yeah, well, we have to have good intentions. We have to use this for the right purposes. But we know what an economy is, and we know what an academy is, and we know what a university is about. We know what a political order is about. And I have a whole series of ends, penultimate ends that take me through my day, and then I offer it up to Jesus. I mean, I don't mean to, mimic or mock that, but it's a bit more than that. It's the order of one's life, okay, which includes both the intelligence and will. It includes the human act, which is always operating with both will and freedom and intelligence. And I think this is so. It's so clear in the decisions that the Pope makes in terms of encyclicals and themes of things that he wants to address, and what he calls integral human liberation, and a theology of liberation. Anyway, so we'll come back to that. The implication of what the Pope means to assert is thus radical. If Jesus Christ is the center of the universe and of history, he must make a difference to everything, to all of us all the time. None of us, in fact, can act or think without somehow implying something about the nature of God. And finally, concretely, about the God, not just any old God, but the God who took flesh in Jesus Christ, Creator and Redeemer. As the center of the universe and history, God is and must be implied in the origin and indeed thereby at the same time in some way in the order and or form of all humanly, creaturely being and action and productions all the time. Christ is the firstborn of all creatures. Now obviously we're going to at some point have to show that that's not suffocating. We don't simply impose that on other realities. This God we're talking about is also the creator and created things with their own natural integrity. So he fulfills those, but in some way he orders them from the beginning. And we need to have a comprehensive sense of that. And I think that's what, again, you'll hear this over and over again, what his integral theology is, authentic theology of integral human liberation. So, as I've already indicated, 2 points in particular then to be highlighted in light of these opening texts. First, and as already indicated in relation to Redemptor Hominis, the centeredness of all things in Christ is not understood by the Pope as a matter merely of a kind of unifying moral intentionality. On the contrary, the claim is ontological, anthropological, and theological. It's also that. It's the order of being, of human being, of God. It concerns the very unity of all cosmic reality, human and non-human, in its created relation to God from the very beginning. This cosmic dimension of creation is emphasized in Dominum et Vivificantem. And I quote, the mystery of the incarnation was brought about by that Spirit, consubstantial with the Father and the Son, who in the absolute mystery of the triune God is the person loved, the uncreated gift, who is the eternal source of every gift that comes from God in the order of creation. The incarnation of God the Son signifies the taking up into unity with God, not only of human nature, but in this human nature, in a sense, of everything that is flesh, the whole of humanity, the entire visible and material world. The incarnation then also has a cosmic significance, a cosmic dimension. The firstborn of all creation becoming incarnate in the individual humanity of Christ unites himself in some way with the entire reality of man, which is also flesh, and in this reality with all flesh, with the whole of creation. End of quote. A second group of texts that are important for John Paul II's pontificate comes from his remarkable but relatively unknown apostolic exhortation, Dies Domini, written in 1989. The late Pope states that Sunday is, quote, the soul of the other days. Sunday, he suggests, is, again I quote, a determining element in the kind of sacred architecture of time which marks biblical revelation, and without a constant awareness of that truth, man cannot serve in the world as co-worker of the Creator. The resurrection of Jesus is the fundamental event upon which Christian faith rests. The event, indeed, which lies at the very heart of the mystery of time, highlighted in the exhortation. Thus we see the sense in which every reality, without exception, must be referred back to God. Time and space belong to him. He is not the God of one day only, but of all the days of humanity. All human life, and therefore all human time, must become praise of the Creator and thanksgiving to him. The Lord's Day is the day of this relationship par excellence, when men and women raise their voice, their song to God, and become the voice of all creation. This indeed, much of this is quotation, is why it is also the day of rest. Further, God saw that creation was good, and this refrain sheds a positive light upon every element of the universe and reveals the secret for a proper understanding of it and for its eventual regeneration. The world is good insofar as it remains tied to its origin, after being disfigured by sin, it is again made good when, with the help of grace, it returns to the one who made it. Again I quote, created in God's image, man was commissioned to subdue the earth and all it contains, to refer himself and the totality of things to God, so that with everything subject to God, the divine name would be glorified in all of the earth. And I quote again, the divine rest of the seventh day does not allude to an inactive God, but emphasizes the fullness of what has been accomplished. It involves a contemplative gaze, which does not look to new accomplishments, but enjoys the beauty of what has already been achieved. It is a gaze which God casts upon all things, but in a special way upon man, the crown of creation. It is a gaze which discloses already something of the nuptial shape of the relationship which God wants to establish with the creature made in his own image, by calling that creature to enter a pact of love. End of text. And again, furthermore, this exhortation states, before decreeing that something be done, the commandment urges that something be remembered. Another important point. Before decreeing that something be done, the commandment urges that something be remembered. It is a call to awaken the remembrance of the grand and fundamental work of God, which is creation, a remembrance which must inspire the entire religious life of man, and then fill the day on which man is called to rest. Rest, therefore, acquires a sacred value. The faithful are called to rest not only as God rested, but to rest in the Lord, bringing the entire creation to him in praise and thanksgiving, intimate as a child and friendly as a spouse. These texts from Dies Domini and regarding the recovery of the Sabbath indicate the contemplative center that orders our lives as creatures, our being that is given to us as gifts from God, as a gift from God. A third set of texts comes from Familiaris Consortio. In himself, says John Paul, God lives a mystery of personal loving communion, creating the human race in his own image. God inscribed in the humanity of man and woman the vocation, and thus the capacity and responsibility of love and communion. Love is therefore the fundamental and innate vocation of every human being. The Pope states further in this connection that in its most profound reality, love is essentially a gift, emphasized in the text. And conjugal love makes spouses capable of the greatest possible gift, the gift by which they become cooperators with God for giving life to a new person. So a gift adds order and structure to love. It isn't just, love can easily be moralized, and I'll have a lot to say about that in the course of these lectures. A love that is a gift has some objective structure. I mean, some action, and involves participation, involves seeing the other, a contemplative dimension, and so forth. It adds order to love, specifies more clearly the order of love. Finally, we cite texts that indicate the sort of behavior that most profoundly undermines the positive principles just cited. It is important relative to the work of John Paul II to see that this wrongful behavior is not a matter first of morality, but more essentially of sin in its deepest theological, spiritual sense. That is, a matter also of objective disorder that involves ontological, theological disorder. And it's interesting in John Paul II's writings, it's why he uses that term objective. Even sin is objective, and uses structural sin, which has perplexed so many people in liberal society, because how can structures sin? The fundamental point there, in other words, an economy, how can it be structurally sinful, or politics, or an academy? And his point is here, there can be an anthropological or an ontological or a theological disorder, not only bad will, but objective disorder. So sin, for John Paul II, I've emphasized enough here, that it involves subjectivity and objectivity, will and intelligence. Now, in the final set of texts here that I would like to cite, a couple of them here, the compendium of the social doctrine of the church, which was commissioned by John Paul II. In that, we find the following statements that are critical for the thesis that we mean to put forward, along with the others. The crucial paragraphs read as follows. God freely confers being and life on everything that exists. Man and woman, created in his image and likeness, are for that very reason called to be the visible sign and the effective instrument of divine gratuitousness in the garden, where God has placed them as cultivators and custodians of the goods of creation. And in the next paragraph, the compendium continues, paragraph 27. The narrative of the first sin in Genesis chapter 3, first 24 verses, describes the permanent temptation and the disordered situation in which humanity comes to find itself after the fall of its progenitors. Disobedience to God means hiding from his loving countenance and seeking to control one's life and action in the world. Breaking the relation of communion with God causes a rupture in the internal unity of the human person, in the relations of communion between a man and a woman, and of the harmonious relations between mankind and other creatures. And then it says, the text says, it is in this original estrangement that are to be sought the deepest roots of all the evils that afflict social relations between people, of all the situations in economic and political life, that attack the dignity of the person, that assail justice and solidarity. The importance of these statements from the compendium can scarcely be exaggerated. First of all, man and woman are understood to be called to be the visible sign and the effective instrument of divine gratuitousness, thereby to be cultivators and custodians of the goods of creation. So signs and effective agents as cultivators and custodian of the goods of creation. Secondly, we find the striking statement that is in hiding from God, from God's gratuitous love and seeking to control our life and action in the world, that we discover the deepest roots of all the worldly evils that attack the dignity of the person and undermine justice and solidarity. So the point then is twofold. On the one hand, men and women are called to participate in God's gratuitousness. On the other hand, every sin in its depths violates the order of that gratuitousness. Okay. I want here Kenneth Schmitz here to put this in more technical language. When he summarizes the work, his little book on Wojtyła and John Paul II, he uses the phrase to summarize the work of Wojtyła, esse creaturae ad esse Deum. And then Schmitz also then talks about the note of receptivity that in the beginning John Paul II was his emphasis in his life, his emphasis on action, but gradually more on receptivity. And I would add to Schmitz's term there, esse creaturae ab esse Deo, so that the being of a creature involves being for God and being from God. That's the heart of what John Paul II is so what I would like to say here, and then I'll just move in a summary fashion to liberals' alternative way of viewing this. It seems to me that one can summarize. This is somewhat arbitrary, but in 7 points, what is then the what makes up what's implied in what I've just said, and what could be said to make up what he means by integral human liberation, to then set us up to look at what that means in a liberal culture, which I will engage more fully in Lecture 3. But first, the given as gift. So the Wojtyła sees this as a whole. The given as gift, and then he speaks of the greatest possible gift in the created order, which is the child, and then the spousal union of a man and woman that brings about a child. The second point is, and all of these are organically related. The second point is the intrinsic or transcendental truth, goodness, and beauty of all things by virtue of their original givenness by God. The third point, third element, the primacy in the human being of the contemplative act of seeing as the necessary condition, imminent condition for acting wisely in relation to God and all of created reality. So the primacy of the contemplative act of seeing. And I think he includes in that a further kind of exigency for prayer in response, a gratitude in response to that gift. Fourth, God is known and loved implicitly by the human being in the depths of every conscious act. So whenever we know God, there's always the deeper, in the depths and implication that we know God. Fifth, the God revealed in Jesus Christ. These all are necessary for the unfolding of gift to make it complete. The God revealed in Jesus Christ is the Logos of love, the ultimate unity of truth and love, and it's important to see in what I want to eventually talk about liberal societies, and particularly America, this God incarnate in Jesus Christ is understood as the Christ of the Nicene Creed and Chalcedon. So, I mean, that's a very important point if we're going to talk about liberal societies, okay? That there is in Jesus Christ, that's understood, that there's a revelation simultaneously in a way that has to be sorted out of the human being, the creature, and God. The sixth, there is God's incarnation in Christ ever presupposes the permission granted in and through the fiat of the woman, Mary. Okay, and finally, this God incarnate in Jesus Christ remains ever present in history in the sacramental church. For John Paul II, an integral society in the full and proper sense, that is, an integrated society with institutions and a way of life that truly liberate, will rest upon and be unified in their depths, at least implicitly, by these truths about being man and God. So again, I emphasize, and perhaps there are more here, but those seven, they have to do with the full sense of what gift is for John Paul II. And it's important to see, I mean, that we'd have to distinguish there between natural and supernatural, but it seems to me important, very important for the work of John Paul II. So you could place that dividing, I mean, in a way, it reaches, the supernatural reaches all the way to the beginning, but you could sort of place it in, when you move to the knowledge of God, it's implicit, but it's certainly in 5, 6, 7. The point is that you have the sense of gift, and it's sustained all the way through by not just, I mean, just ultimately, gift has to go all the way through. And that, to me, is fundamental importance. So it's Chalcedonian Christology, a faith in the creed, and the fiat, the letting be of reality is infinitely deepened in the Marian fiat, that she sort of replicates that contemplative act now in a supernatural mode with respect to the coming into being of Christ himself, and then the sacrament, that Jesus remains in history. And it seems to me extremely, I mean, it's fundamentally important, particularly in relation to a liberal society. And what I'm not going to get deeply into liberal societies. I mean, because there's a lot to say about that. But just to say at the outset, the first thing that when you come to liberal societies, the question is, what about liberal democratic societies? And this is why part of my argument here as we proceed is that to make it a bit more contentious here perhaps and aggressive is really what I want to say here now is that in a certain sense this Catholic vision on the one hand and the liberal vision on the other represent the polar choices. Now we have China and we have to deal with overtly repressive regimes. But what's the point? The point here is, on the one hand, you have the fullness of gift, which goes all the way into the heart of God as its ground. And so you sustain that notion that the givenness of things ultimately is tied to the infinite generosity of God reflected in these ways. And liberalism begins by saying all of that is yet to come. What is it that you say is, I wouldn't say, and I will deal with this again much more thoroughly in the final lecture, but it's an abstraction from God, but it's not exactly an abstraction from God. It's an abstraction from God in a way that God causes, because and I'm assuming I'm jumping here to America being a paradigm of a liberal society, and I'll say more about that also. But the point is, it's not so much an abstraction from God. I mean, it is that he's far away, but in a way you can almost say the contrary. The problem is God is distant, and the God at the heart of America is a God who's distant and who's a God of power. This point is fundamental, and so the use of things so that in the engagement with reality, you see that there's a contradiction with this other vision, and I would say that the American liberal vision, insofar as you draw it all out, represents the precise contrary of the 7 elements of John Paul II regarding gift, that in the liberal society presupposes and is guided by 7 negatives there at each point, and that it's a question of God being distant, God being a matter of power, that engagement with reality is from the get-go a matter of control and instrumentalizing. It goes to the heart of American liberalism, that is, what's given has no intrinsic worth. It's the transcendentals are denied being as good as gift as that's fundamentally rejected, so that the human being from the outset in liberalism, the agent is an agent of power, and of a power that is immediately it's power in the sense of instrumental power. You instrumentalize for the sake of what is ultimate, for this distant God. And I think, so what I will to leave some time here. It's been almost an hour. What I want to say is then that liberal societies, and we're going to have to deal with, it's not to say that there aren't positive goods like freedom and equality, but those are taken up into an entire vision that has to be corrected. The contention of these lectures is that liberal societies rest their way of life, the order of their institutions, on an implied denial fundamentally of what is termed the logic of gift, the denial of the given as gift, and thereby as well of a generous creator God. My contention indeed is that this implied denial of the given, of the givenness of being as gift, entails an a priori denial of all 7 elements of John Paul II's theology of integral human liberation. Put positively, what unifies liberal societies, logically, if not intentionally, there's always strong moral intentionality, and we always have to qualify that. America's not atheistic in that sense. Put positively, what unifies liberal societies, logically, even if not intentionally, is an understanding of reality in hiddenly power-driven, instrumentalist terms, even if sometimes accompanied by positive moral or religious intentions on the part of the persons making up these societies. Therefore, liberal societies bear their own characteristic in integralism. And this is a point that I will also deal more with in more detail later. The assumption in John Paul II is there is an integration, integral in the sense of integration of all things in light of the notion of gift. And there's a counterpart to that in liberal societies, which is to say, insofar as they're formed originally in Puritanism or secularized Puritanism, that there's still a unity, but the unity is coerced, and the coercion is somewhat paradoxical because it's coerced in terms of a formal juridical proceduralism, which claims to be empty of any definite claims of truth. Okay, and this would be something. So the liberal societies, I pointed out the 7 elements of John Paul II, and the point is the liberal societies are not neutral, but they embody 7 counter elements. And granted what may be termed a certain moral intentionality in common regarding freedom and the like, the respective visions of liberal societies and John Paul II contain deeply different senses of human civil order. And I will simply end with that, and we will start next time. I will take an interlude. I want to deal with this problem of abstracting of moral intentions from objective order in some other contexts, and then come back again to this context and pick it up in terms of specifically America's liberal society. So, thank you very much.
for a simple and very profound reflection. Maybe if there are questions here on the audience, just please raise your hand. In the meantime, I have a couple of questions. Yeah, the first question I have is just if something you said. I have two questions. One at the beginning, and the other regards something you mentioned at the end. At a certain point, you mentioned, as a clarification question, that gift adds order and structure to love. Right? So you could unfold this a little bit more in what sense? No? And yeah, the other question I had was, you pit this theology of John Paul II against liberalism a little bit, and if I understood correctly, it would be this dialogue or dialectic perhaps between power and gift as primals, right? Now my question is a little more generic, no, as of how to think of this alternative, no, because also power belongs to gift as well. God is omnipotent as well, no? And how to think of this alternative so to avoid the liberal, no, I guess, or could define the liberal allurement, no, of there are two different possibilities and one just goes for one as opposed to the other, right? Chooses one instead of the other. No? So what is the original starting point that makes reasonable to begin with, as you propose, gift rather than power?
Yes, thank you. The first, gift brings order to love. I mean, obviously you can understand love in lots of ways, but I mean, in God, love is a word, right? And it seems to me in the created order, we abstract from the unity of the human act too often. You know, we abstract good intentions, moral intentions, from it's immediately sort of things are there and it depends on how you use them. But I'll get into that. You know, I mean, we take it obvious that the end of an economy is profit, prosperity, wealth. The end of a polity is freedom. The end of an academy is sort of knowledge, conceived to be control of meaning and truth and so on. All of those are just fraught with assumptions that have to be unpacked. I mean, and the point is that it isn't just a matter of, in each case, it depends on how we use it, how we use wealth, etc. In each case, it has to do with the logic of gift. I mean, if I may here, I want to read. Can I read? I'd like to. There were two texts that I actually meant to quote here. John Paul II, that I think are very helpful texts to open up what I want to say. This is a message for the 2000 World Day of Peace. John Paul II says, we need to examine the growing concern felt by many, and it's with respect to the economy, but I'll generalize here. We need to examine the growing concern felt by many economists and financial professionals when, in considering new issues involving poverty, peace, ecology, and the future of the younger generation, they reflect on the role of the market, on the pervasive influence of monetary and financial interests, and on other similar issues related to economic activity. perhaps the time has come for a new and deeper reflection on the nature of the economy and its purposes. What seems to be urgently needed is a reconsideration of the concept of prosperity, benessere, itself, to prevent it from being enclosed in a narrow utilitarian perspective. And then he goes on, he says every person and the whole person, and he says, but it's the final sentence here, and then I read also Ratzinger in his final sentence. An economy which does not seek to serve the good of every person and the whole person, cannot really call itself an economy. That's what I mean by the order question. It isn't just a question that you take that the structure and end of an economy and put it to good use. If it isn't qua order, if the very way that what you're making, how you make it, and for what purposes isn't integrated, then you can't. He's saying something very much more radical here, which is you can't call it an economy. And the words of Cardinal Ratzinger in this context, well, it's later, but the same point, are even stronger, it seems to me. He says in Caritas in Veritate, Pope Benedict, he says, he confirms John Paul II's teaching regarding the nature or meaning of the economy with an explicit emphasis on the logic of gift. He says, quote, the principle of gratuitousness and the logic of gift can and must find their place within normal economic activity. This is a human demand at the present time, but it is also demanded by economic logic. What's the implication of the two popes here? What the implication is, it is precisely what I'm trying to say. We have to rethink the order of liberal institutions. That's the point, and the way of life in a liberal society. It's not to reject it and to whole cloth, but it is to enter into it and reorder the institutions of the society, and liberal institutions, not only China's institutions, but liberal, the Western liberal. So it's not merely, it doesn't involve merely the addition of good intentions, but it's including the principle of gratuitousness in some sense, generosity in the very logic of the way we work, how we organize, et cetera, what we're making, how we make it, we choose to make it, how we market it. And so that I take to be so fundamental. If you moralize John Paul II and Benedict, it's not very interesting. I mean, it sounds like overheated liberalism. Oh, in other words, well, you need to invest this with good intentions. I mean, you know, the liberal economy is very much on their minds when they say these things. Now, the other question on power, you may have to elaborate. So the question of order here is fundamental. But the question of how to think about power and gift, I mean, maybe you can elaborate that. I mean, because there are all kinds of power, but what they're talking about here is the power of generosity has a primacy. And I you know, I could start saying things about that now, but I mean, the logic of liberal institutions, the penultimate, once you set aside the ultimate end, the penultimate ends all are inadequate, become quickly inadequate. No integration in light of what is ultimately good and beautiful. But maybe you can say more about, I mean,
Just quickly,
power and
the other
generosity.
questions. But I mean, just my question was driving at the fact that what kind of beginning makes reasonable the account of the world of things, as you said, to put it shortly, as gift, right, as opposed of power, which is to be the primal in liberal societies.
Yeah, I don't ask. I mean, I think the heart of it is a primacy of generosity. It's not expected somehow, all of which is preaching, counter, realize what that means, have a lifetime to that means. It seems John Paul II is saying it's power, the sort of power that ought generosity, and not in a way that takes over what various areas, but always provide orders.
If you don't mind going to the microphone so that also the people who are online hear you.
Thank you, Dr. Schindler. My question is twofold. First, in your emphasis on the primacy of God, you insist on talking about the human subject's relation to God is ordering to God existing on the ontological order, that it's a given structure of his being to be a man for God, and not necessarily just on the level of moral intentionality. So I wondered if you could say something about, or address the obvious objection. How does this given structure not sort of stack the deck, so to speak, metaphysically to a kind of determinism, so that the response of the human subject would then be some kind of foregone conclusion, because that's how he's built, so to speak. And related to that, for the second part, I was interested in hearing a few more words about your sixth point of John Paul II's summary of a character of gift, and that's to do with the Marian fiat. Why is Mary's fiat an important and intrinsic part of understanding what gift is?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take the second question first. On the fiat, I think, I mean, obviously this has to do with the incarnation of God, and so that's its basic reality, has to be understood in that context. But it seems to me the fiat, the woman, and letting it be as once you secure and stay with the original meaning, which one has to do, this has an ontological density, and which is what? Let it be, which means let God be God. In this case, I mean, let God be, let your will be done in me. But it's, by implication, it's let everything that God does in his goodness as creator and redeemer be done. In other words, it's a fundamental receptivity, not passivity, but a receptivity, a contemplative act, an actively contemplative act, right at the heart of the faith, so that's both in the natural order and in the supernatural order. And it seems to me that goes to the heart of the Catholic understanding of Christianity, the fiat. Let it be done is all, at the deepest level, is always the first act of the creature. Let it be, because I'm not the source. I am a source, but I'm a participant. I'm a participatory source. So let it be is always it's responding to something, action that precedes me. And I think again, then I'll move on. But when we get to a liberal order, we see, and again the paradigm in America is absolutely, if there's anything, I mean, all 7 of those points that I made are absent, but the assumption regarding the nature of God and the nature of the human individual in relation to God undercuts that. That's why, again, I will say over and over again, I think America represents this kind of paradigm. It's hard to think of anything that is more thoroughly and profoundly rejected in America than a fiat. I mean, especially now. I mean, it's taken on all these, but it's an active receptivity. I don't know if that's, and then the ontological order. You have to correct me on that. Whether it's a determinism, do you mean that I necessarily have to find God? This is a huge question. It's a dynamism and it's implicit, and I'm not born and say I'm looking for Jesus, and that guy, not that Jesus, this Jesus, etc., etc. But there's a subtlety there. It's always, I am moving toward something. I'm not indifferent toward it, but I'm moving toward it, and it's simultaneously something that whose reality I recognize in a certain way for the first time when I actually encounter it. And at that point, I recognize that as something I always was, that's what I was seeking for. That was it. Which means the search wasn't neutral. That the search already had an end. And it's so important to see that. I mean, and that's why then you can start talking about why the environment, a good home, in a sacramental church, and all of these things in an environment are there to order from the beginning your movement, your desire for God. So the determinism, if this is what you meant, I cannot not know God implicitly. At the depths of my being, I think that's the case. But that doesn't mean. But that's a subtle thing. It's implicit. I still have to encounter it somehow. I have to encounter it, and then it's the recognition, and then I know this is right and that is wrong. Okay, and so, but there's no determinism. I mean, because you need all of those things in life, in history, family, friendship, and so on, and the church that help you pay attention, direct your attention. So, thank you.
Dr. Schindler.
So thank you for your first lecture here. I was thinking as you were presenting it, this theme that I've always found compelling about the Christian mission to receive the whole logic of love and gift all the way into the, as you put it, the heart of the world. So it this implies a profound entry into the inner structures of the political order, the economic order, the various dimensions of life. Now, to make that case, the sources that you were drawing on here are John Paul II, in this lecture, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, in a certain sense, Vatican II. And my question is connected with that. In a certain sense, these days, those are not sort of fashionable sources. One gets a strong impression, especially among the most sort of fervent Catholics in America, that John Paul II, Vatican II, above all, are part of the problem. And in part, this is, in response to the extraordinary disorder that we're seeing in the world right now. But I wonder if you could respond to that. Is there a special connection between this recognition of the Christian mission as a penetration into the heart of the world? Is that something that Vatican II showed us? So if whatever the problems might be, or another way of putting it is this something that was not as evident in the preceding tradition, that these particular figures, especially John Paul II and Benedict XVI, can help us to see?
Yes, maybe I can say a couple things, and you may want to, give more examples, or, where to start on this? Yes, I've heard those criticisms also. And I'm not sure if I can answer those completely, but it's a misunderstanding of John Paul II. It's simply what happened in that papacy was unifying. If you want to call it truth and love, the unification of that, and I think so much of the, but maybe you can respond to this. I think some of the resistance, my own parents, some resistance, because they thought it was too soft and didn't emphasize the truth enough, and so on. And I don't see that, but it is true that if you emphasize a unity of truth and love, your method changes. I think, and again, I don't know if this answers the types of criticisms that you have, and now it's slipping my mind, but I think there's a resistance that I've encountered when I engaged in some writings, regarding the economy and John Paul II. There's a kind of engagement that what they want is a moral tightening, or a more rigorous pronouncement of the morality of the situation, but they're less concerned with the structure, and I really, like the economy, it's taken for granted. Well, there's a free economy, and there's a Marxist or a left-wing economy, and politics. It's about freedom, and it's a question of what you do with the freedom. And and all I can say in response to that is, unless your response goes to the root and involves an integration from the get-go, you're not going to make, you're really not going to challenge at the level that needs to be challenged. But I have that same experience. It's sort of, there's a new book out I'm going to have to say a few words about, by an old friend of mine from graduate school, if you can believe it. We go back 45 years. We were in the same class, but obviously he went in a different direction. Anyway, it's on America, and it's sort of, he doesn't like all of this criticism of America. And why is that? Well, he really likes the order, the liberal order in politics. The rightful understanding of that is a conservative liberal order, so to speak. Rather than, that there's an issue that goes to the root meaning of freedom and rights and what a government is about and so on. So I don't know if that gets much, gets to the point, but the lack of integration, there's a moral rigor often and a theological rigor that simply has not come to terms with what seems to me what is really the novelty, the development in John Paul II and Benedict, which is the integration of all of these orders, love and God-centeredness and so on, but and really transforming the culture, and also the liberal culture. Anyway, if you have further questions or comments.
I'd like to read one of the questions we got online from the audience outside of this room. It says,
he's making it up.
Nice try. So, this person says, thank you very much for the profound and engaging lecture. My question is the following. Could you elaborate a little bit more about the connection between what you said and the church? In other words, it seems to me that the ontology of the gift is truly preserved only in the church. What are the ecclesiological implications of what you said today in your lecture? Is the church the only alternative to liberalism? Of course, you may speak to this in the next lectures. If this is the case, well, then disregard my question.
Well, first, I would like to make this a little feisty. I'm glad this person saw the implication. I do think that the question of Catholicism is the question that needs to be confronted in relation to liberalism, for the simple reason it's the only place. That's why I laid out all 7 of those points, and you could add a few more, is precisely to see that a completeness to this has to go all the way through to ecclesiology. In other words, and it can be integral as distinct from integralist only if that movement is rooted in the truth of all of the realities. That's all the way through. And you can, what's a human being? What are things around us? This is why the beautiful document, Dies Domini, to read that, we all read that and it's pious. What are you going to do on Sunday? It's a time to rest and see, look, this is the true order of things. It doesn't exclude work, but it integrates work. That's a profound insight. It's not just a more. So then in the ecclesiological interpretations, I do think, I've got to think this through further, but in a certain sense, I think the fundamental issue that I guess what's really a novel here is, well, I don't want to call it novel. It's that the debates we get into these things, it seems to me we need to press them to their radical roots. And I find so much of the discussion that we, and if you do, the issue becomes Catholicism. You have to deal with Catholicism. Now, it's question begging in a certain manner of speaking, because there's faith involved, okay? But that you don't stop with presenting the logic of gift intrinsically and from below, so to speak. But ultimately, then you have to get into ecclesiological questions. As a matter of faith, involve faith, supernatural faith, but they're still at the same time, no one is indifferent to that question. No one is indifferent to Catholicism at root. I believe that, okay? And that might have to be sorted out. But then on the other side, liberalism to me is absolutely, it's so interesting because it's not just another overt, nasty totalitarianism. It makes an appeal. Why has it been so widespread and embraced? It promises, look, you can work it out for yourself, and you determine it, and then we come together and we'll have this procedural, juridical, procedural order that does nothing but allow you the freedom to do that. My contention is that's already liberal substance. That is a liberal ecclesiology in some manner of speaking, okay? And that's where I think in the end with my friend Robert Riley and his book, and I'll deal with that in my third lecture a little bit, is in the end that's where we really part ways, okay? And there's so much more that can be said about that. But once you remove totalitarianism, it seems to me, if you really press the issue, you're a liberal or you're a Catholic. Geez, anybody got this place bugged? I don't know. Okay.
It's all online. It's all online. One last question, Dr. Hamby.
Thank you very much for that. It was wonderful. And this may also be a question that you can disregard or punt downfield if it anticipates later lectures. But you made a distinction there that I want to pick up on and ask you to say a bit more about, and that's the distinction between integral liberation and integralism. Because some of the folks that Dr. Schindler, the other Dr. Schindler, mentioned, who seem to be taking a hard line and a kind of a reactionary line against everything to do with the council, really, or doing so in the name of revived integralism. So where does the essential difference, because you're also saying, right, that this logic has to penetrate all the way down to the very heart of institutions. So does the essential difference consist in the fact that it's first ontological and theological before it is political? Or is there another way that you would characterize that? But I'd like to hear more about that distinction.
On integralism?
Yeah, how you would differentiate genuine integral liberation and the kind of penetration of structures that you're talking about from an integralist understanding of the same thing. Because, right, isn't that part of the point of integralism? Right. To reassume control, for lack of a better word, or to reassert ecclesial authority over structures. So perhaps you could say something about that.
Yeah, no, these are such profound and subtle questions. But first of all, integral for me has to do with affirming whatever is done in a way that's consistent with its integrity as the integrity of its natural meaning and truth. And that involves a kind of letting be, but letting be is not formless. It's letting form letting actively helping something to come into form. And but it seems to me. So I would say that, and it seems to me integralism wants to short circuit that, and now you get into huge prudential questions, But integralism, it seems to me, wants to get things together, and then a disposition to then control politically. So it's a kind of coercion that's a political coercion. And I mean, these questions have to be sorted out, but I would say on what I call integral, there's you need to order the state. You need to have a real state that exercises real authority, and yet at the same time, this gets so complicated. I mean, real authority, but that authority has to take into account, for example, the integrity of the religious dimension. I mean, and there has to be some duality there. I'm losing. I'm not putting that in a very good order, but yeah, I would want to go back and forth a bit more on this. Do you have any questions to help me further differentiate that? Okay. Yeah, I think the question of, let me just say this in terms of the current discussion, at least insofar as I'm inside it, and I'm not much inside it, is I think that I think we need to think about integralist first in terms of the meaning of things and the truth of things, and then political power and authority in that context. That would be the key. And then the second thing would be a proper integration into the truth. But that sounds like, okay, here it comes again. But built into the truth ultimately goes back to the unity of truth and love in God Himself. That love and mercy are not foreign to the truth, but their truth and love are integrate. You can never separate them. And so that would be the other dimension. But basically, the thing I want to say to get into, in relative to this debate is, I think the problem is that liberals always are sort of scot-free. Okay, in other words, all you guys out there, unlike us, want to impose something, a vision, and we don't. Well, that has to be, as a starting point, unmasked. That's just, it doesn't hold water. It's got built into it a certain conception of what freedom and intelligence are, what God is, what being is, and so forth. And you'd have to sort that out. That is, yeah. Okay, I'll stop there.
Right. Thank you very much. We'll interrupt here, and then we'll come back to hear the second lecture on Wednesday at 7 p.m. on Truth and Freedom. Thank you very much.
Truth and freedom, and it'll be this 2 or 3 disjunctions like that, as part of this problem of what about the truth question, subject and objective truth, and subjective appropriation in the order of morality, in the order of religion, the order of religious freedom. Okay.